Oh, I got a question here. Yeah, well, I'll answer a question. Sorry, I'll answer questions about that.
Yeah, just whenever. Yeah, I'll just put it down.
Yeah. So if you have questions about like the testing or anything else, you can also feel free to ask me. All right. Just got a fancy slideshow for you. So does anyone know what React is or why it exists?
Did Facebook make it just because they needed something better?
Yeah, Facebook did make it. So, this started out as an internal tool at Facebook, and then they open sourced it. So, Facebook, like, any large, web application, there's a lot going on, and you can't just serve up simple HTML. There's so many different things happening on a page, and when you click on something, the page changes. You see other options. So it's almost like there's all these little mini apps kind of, or mini pages embedded in one larger page, and there's lots of user actions that are influencing things. So what React does, it does a couple things. One, it allows you to design a web application using tiny pieces that you can then assemble and put together to make everything. So it's easy to chop things up and then reconstitute a web page from reusable pieces. The other thing that it allows you to do is handle basically change events. So React calls this state. So state is kind of a technical term in React, and it's just we'll talk more about what this is, but this is basically anything in a component that might change, usually based on some kind of user action. So like, event listeners and things like that. Okay, so we are experts at Django, so we know about models, templates, and views. And we're going to get it to React, which is kind of a replacement for templates, basically. And we'll end up connecting after we do React for a few weeks. We'll have a few days to a week where we combine React and something called the Django REST framework, which is basically Django minus the templates, plus some other stuff which we can worry about later. So on Saturday, the exercise that you guys did maybe introduced you. It was already set up, but you got to see this, at least this Webpack config, and there's a build file and all that kind of stuff. So you don't really need to worry too much about that, but it just gives you some exposure. So Babel and Webpack are two tools that are kind of built into React. So you don't really need to do anything with these. They're already built into React, but just so you know what they are. Babel is basically a transpiler. So we have, fancy new JavaScript comes out every few years with new features and new syntax and everything. But the problem is that browsers need to support that new syntax in order for it to be usable. And every browser is a little bit different. You have all kinds of different companies that support different features and not something else, and there's minor variations and so on. So you have all these issues with cross-browser compatibility, and that goes, that's not just strictly JavaScript features, but that goes for other things as well. What Babel does is allows you to write in the latest, greatest, fancy new JavaScript, and then it takes all of your fancy JavaScript and turns it into the lowest common denominator JavaScript. So it will basically run on any browser, and there's all kinds of settings. And you can play around. If you look this up online, you can actually see what it looks like, and it doesn't really look like JavaScript. I mean, it's really like low level kind of. It looks very low level. And then Webpack, which we saw on Saturday, basically just, yeah, it's a build tool. It kind of takes everything that you write in an application and turns it into one thing that you can serve up. So you don't have to worry about these things, but just so you know, they're there. So this create React app. So just like Django has a way for you to start with this boilerplate all ready to go, create project and create app. React has something similar, and it's called create React app. Create React app. It's kind of like Django create project or start project. It will create all of the stuff that React needs, and React needs a whole bunch of stuff. We'll see when we set up the project. It will take a couple minutes to download everything. So all of the dependencies for React, including all kinds of kind of secondary tools that get integrated into React to help with the build process and everything else. So there's a whole ecosystem, and create React app is kind of what you use to get started, unless you have very specific requirements. Okay, so there are, let's say three main concepts. We'll group them into. So one main concept that you'll, in order to think like React or to think in React, you need to think about a web application as a collection of components. The other two things are props and state, which we'll talk about in a sec. And we'll talk more about props and state in the coming days. So components first, we have a web app or a web, we go to Airbnb and we get this page, and how might we divide this up? I mean, first off, we could just write one huge HTML file that has all of this in there, and that's definitely something you could do. And if this were Django, you'd be using templates, and you could maybe use some inheritance. So you could have maybe something like this shows up on every page. So you have the nav bar, and that gets, that extends whatever, that's like the base HTML, and so on and so forth. But there's going to be a lot of your basic HTML file is going to be fairly lengthy if you do something like this. So can anyone talk about, how could we divide this? Well, even if this were a Django template, how would we chop this up?
All right, we got a header.
Yeah.
We got a nav bar.
Yeah.
We've got our, I meant that is in the header. So then the one just says dates guess, be like our nav bar.
Okay.
Then we can come down to whatever page we're on, our outdoor activities, and then it's going to load whatever activities we have in that data set.
Mhm.
And then down here, we got a bunch of pictures in that data set, or like a bunch of more sub. So there's just those 5 things.
So
Or 4 things.
is this picture a component? Would this picture be a component by itself?
Yeah, I think it'd
Okay.
be all part of a chain, and then that would be its own thing at the end.
What
And then it's
about
probably,
what about this text on the bottom?
no, I think that's just a card. I mean, it could be, but I think that's a whole card, maybe split into 2 pieces. But
Okay, so maybe this whole card is a component, and then this picture could also, because you can have components inside of components. So we could have like a card component, and then an image component, and then a description component. This whole thing could be like a main display component, which has let's say like a link, a nav, like a navigation component here, a title component. So there's, in some ways, there isn't always an obvious answer for how many components should you divide this into. So there's some subjectivity here, but I think we can definitely point out things that repeat. So like this box, hiking, agriculture, camping, this is the same element, right? It's pretty obvious that this is the same element. So if this were a class, we would have like, box with title and number of things, right? So we might pass these in as instance variables. We create our little activity card class, and then we create 3 instances with specific kind of instance attributes that are specific to each one. And the same thing with these cards. Obviously, they're all different. They have different images, they have different text, but they're all the same thing. So we could create a class, and then this card class here could also contain like an image class, an activity image class, which would be instantiated with its own image every time, and so on. So thinking about components this way, thinking about them in terms of classes or functions. So another thing we'll see as we do React is that React, React can be, you can make React apps either functionally or in OOP using classes. They both are very similar and will end up doing the same thing, but it's a different style. We can talk more about that as we go on, but you can think of all of these as classes, basically. A component is like a class. So here's just one example of how you could analyze this. So component 1, component 2, component 3. And notice that there are a whole bunch of instances of this supposed component 3, and a whole bunch of instances of this component 2, and this one, and so on. So components can contain other components as well. So here's kind of a zoomed in view of this component, which we can also think of as containing other components. So I want to point out that this syntax here, does this look like anything familiar?
HTML.
Yeah, it looks like HTML. It looks like, a custom HTML tag. And this is how React, this is how React wants you to think about web applications. So you write JavaScript that looks like HTML. So it's a bit weird at first, but it's kind of like combining the Jinja 2 syntax from Django templates with the views at the same time. And we'll see what that looks like. But these are basically like this would be basically like calling a function called favorite icon, or like component 3. It's be calling or creating an instance of a class called component 3. So that's how React does this. So this component 3, this outer line right here, it has several subcomponents, or has 2 subcomponents. One is this card image, let's just say, right? And the other is this what's called card main here, like the description. And then these components can themselves contain other components. So this star rating here, this is its own component. So should this be its own component or not? Well, that's a decision you can make, but here it is. And then this favorite icon is also another component. So if this favorite icon appears or could appear in lots of places in your app, that's a good way. That's a good indication that should be pulled out into its own component, so that you're not rewriting the same code over and over and over again. So this ends up being like a hierarchy. So remember that component 3 is also a component in like the app. So we have app, we have a bunch of components. Like component 3 also contains its own children, which contain their own children, and so on. So we have this props starting to pop up here. So we'll talk more. It's easier to see with examples, I think, but props is just, you can think of it like instance attributes or calling a function with parameters. So it's something that you pass. So when you create an instance of component 3, you can create it with some keyword arguments, and then its children will have access to that. And this is all abstract, but we'll see examples soon. So two other things besides components, like how you think about constructing a React application, there are two important, let's say, internals, like React internals you need to understand well. One is props. And props is, as I just said, information that's passed from a caller or like a parent, depending on if you're using functional or class components, but from the caller or parent component. And that information only goes downhill. So it goes from parent to child. So information flow in React is always from higher to lower, from parent to child. You can't directly, so that, you know, of course there are ways to do this, which we'll see, but you can't directly pass information from a child to a parent. So props is a way, kind of like a keyword argument or something like that. It's a way of passing information into a component. State is information that is internal to a component. This is like a private variable. So it's not, you're not supposed to be able to access it from outside of the instance or the component. And state, what you put in state is going to be basically anything in this component that is going to change. So if you have something in a component that's changeable, then that will go in state. And React, when it does its React magic, if the value of a component's state changes, it knows to re-render the component, which means basically repaint the DOM, or at least the part of the DOM that needs to be repainted with the updated value, that changed state. So those are kind of, that's just the basic. I don't usually like giving kind of abstract introductions, but I'm doing that for React. So that's kind of the abstract introduction to React. You have these things, you have components. So this is just a way of dividing up an application. And then you have props and state, which is how you handle information within. Props is information from parent to child, and state is information within a component. Okay, so we have a README for today, and you can go through it. I'm gonna do another example here. So the first thing I'm gonna do is create all of the boilerplate, and I can do that with npx, not npm, create React app, and then the name of my application, which I will call React colors. Now this is going to take probably like 2 minutes. It will depend on your internet connection and everything else. So it's definitely a lengthier process than. So while we wait for this, are there any questions?
Where does the npx come from?
I should know the answer to that, but I've just used it. I haven't really looked into it, but it's a script that will basically execute. I'm not. Yeah, I should look into that so I have an answer.
Does anything need to be installed first before we can run npx create React app?
No, no. So you can see all of the dependencies that React needs. It's a long, long list.
Is this gonna have its own database thing? And then we'll.
No.
No, okay, so.
Yeah, there's no database.
I'm curious how this is gonna work, okay.
Yeah, if you want, you'll have to make API calls to your backend. So as you can imagine, this is like, a security nightmare, all of the dependencies.
So why don't we need to use a virtual environment when we're doing React?
Just because of the way npm, so npm by default will not install things globally. In older versions, that wasn't the case, but it will. If you see here, it's just like when you run npm init, it will start a node project, and if you install things by default, it will install them basically locally in this node modules folder. So you're not installing things globally on your machine by default. So basically, this is a virtual environment for all intents and purposes. So React app ran and created the the project name, the app name. Again, annoying Django to React terminology. So app in React refers to the whole thing. So we get a whole bunch of stuff. So we get package.json. So what is the package.json?
It's all the dependencies it installed.
Yeah. It's dependencies. There's a couple other things, but for our purposes now, this is what's important. There's also some things. So this is not, if you just do npm init, you're not going to get all of these scripts. So this is something that React is doing for you. So React is starting you off the way it wants you to be started off. And if you run npm test, React has its own, testing system integrated into it. It uses Jest, but it's kind of like, it comes preloaded, so you don't need to separately install Jest. Start will start the development server. So just like running Python manage.py run server in Django. And then build will, once you're ready to deploy, this will take all your code and run, Webpack and Babel and all the processors that will turn it into a deployable folder. So you don't have to worry too much about that. But here we have the package.json, the package lock, which you don't need to do anything with. It comes with a git ignore. And if I cd React, you can see that I'm in a Git repository. So running this has automatically created, it's run, Git init. So I have, when I create a React app by default, I'm also in a Git repository, so I can start committing. I have a git ignore file with a bunch of defaults in here. And then I have two folders here that I care about. public I care about a little bit. It's the main thing that I care about. So the main thing I care about is this index file. And this is basically what will end up getting served. So this is the HTML file that will get served up. And we can see that in the body, so there's a bunch of stuff going on here, but the body has this one div with an ID of root. So everything that you write ultimately is going to go right here. It's going to go right inside this div. And this source is where you're going to write everything. So we'll take a look at some of this stuff. So index.js, so we have index.html. We also have index.js. So this is the main entry point for the JavaScript side of things. And we can see that there's some React specific things happening. So we have a bunch of imports, including index.css files. We're including a bunch of stuff. And then there's a function being called here. It React DOM, and then the render method on React DOM. And then we don't really need to worry about these, but this app. So this app, it looks like HTML, right? But it looks like HTML, but it's actually a class or a function. And we'll take a look at what app is in a second. But here, this render method is taking two parameters. One of them is, basically like the entry point for your application. And the other is where you want to put it, which is the root. So if you remember the index.html, we have this div with an ID of root. So this is saying, take everything that you write in app.js and stick it in the root of that HTML file. So now let's take a look at app.js. So finally, we are now at the place where we're actually going to be working in React. So app will be the place where you actually start really writing your code. So this is all the default stuff. So just like Django comes with the default, hey, everything's working app, React does the same thing. So I can run, if I follow the instructions here, we suggest you begin with typing cd into the folder, which I did, and then npm start. And npm start will run that script, the development server. So npm run start, or just npm start. Okay, so it took a second, but this is the default app that's now running. I'm gonna move this over. Okay. So I have this app, and I can see that this is a function. So we'll talk more about functions and classes. By default now, basically, the React developers want you to use functional components, but class-based components are still supported. And unless you're starting a new project, you're probably going to see both. So we will teach you both function and classes, and it's not that hard to, once you do it a couple times, switching between class and functional components is not that hard. Okay, so we got this app component. It's returning something, and we have a multi-line return, so we can use a parentheses. And then we have what looks like HTML, but is actually called JSX, which it's just like React's version of Jinja templates, where it looks like it looks like HTML, but it's actually JavaScript. So you can kind of combine the view logic and the template logic in one place. So I can get rid of some of the stuff. I'm going to go ahead and keep the header. Yes. I can delete this and save, and I'll get a hot reload. So I can add stuff here. And this will show up. So this is hot reload in the development server. So a couple things to note that might be a little tricky as you're developing. One is that this looks like HTML, but it's not actually HTML. And so if this were HTML, we would not have class name equals app, but just class equals app, right? You may remember that from way back when. But class is a reserved word in JavaScript, so you can't use class here. So class name. So sometimes you'll get like minor things like that. So just something to be aware of. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm not really going to talk about functional components. We can start talking about that tomorrow, but for today, we'll just worry about class-based components. So I'm going to turn this into a class-based component. You don't need to worry about what I'm doing right now. We'll get lots of practice doing this. So import I'm just going to change this. This is class app. And every component that you write, with some possible exceptions, but basically by default, every component you write will inherit from React's component, right? So your components will inherit from React component. So oops, extends. So React comes with this component that you can inherit from. And so when you write one, you will do this. And then a class needs a render method. Render method. And then inside that render method, you can return and now it's the same, except I'm using a class-based component instead of a functional component. Another thing that I would suggest you get, not mandatory by any means, but there's a React-specific developer tools, which is very nice to have. So if you're using Chrome, there's a browser extension. So React Dev Tools. You can add this, and it just makes it'll make your life a lot easier. So I can go in here, and the normal dev tools, you should have, once you install it, you should have this additional option here called components. And I only have one component, which is the app component. But you can click on it, and we'll see. We'll see in a second that this will be more helpful. One, this will show you the hierarchy and the structure of your entire application, so you can see all of the components and kind of where they are, and then you can get the props and the state for each one, which is very, very handy when you're debugging.
What was the name of that extension again?
React Dev Tools, I believe,
Thank you.
or React Developer Tools. Okay. So I'll go back out of here. And so now we have a class-based component. So I'm gonna get rid of this right here. And this right here. So I've gotten rid of my classes. So this CSS. So we'll talk more about CSS, but there's an index CSS, which is kind of for everything. You can see body and code, and then the app.css, which is for this particular component. So you can write CSS, like basically a CSS file per component. You can also do inline CSS, and then you can just have one CSS. You could have one big CSS file for everything here. We'll see more of that later. So I have this component right here, and this is still displaying. So what happens? So I'm going to write let's see, p. Okay, I'm going to save this, and now I have an error. Failed to compile. They're telling me where the error is occurring in the source app.js. And I get a little, so on line 10, there's something wrong with line 10. So syntax error, adjacent JSX element. So what's a JSX element?
It's React.
All the stuff that looks
React
like HTML.
code that's meant to look like HTML. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So this H1, this supposed H1 is a JSX element. It looks like HTML, but it's actually JavaScript. So adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So one rule for components is that they have to return one single thing. So here we're returning two things. We're returning H1 tag and a P tag. So this doesn't mean that we're not allowed to return, two things here. We just have to wrap these in one thing. So the default thing to do, since div is kind of like a meaningless tag, you just wrap them in a div, and now I'm returning one single element, which is a div. That div happens to contain two other elements, but I don't care about that. There's also something, there's a built-in component called the fragment, which is, kind of a way of handling this situation where you just have a dummy div, but you don't need to worry about that right now. So if you want to return more than one thing, you can wrap it in a div, and that will work. Okay. So let's say I want to have a button. So I can add a button here. I have a button class. And now this, I have a button class. But maybe we could, just like Django, we could just have, one view function or one route and one view function handle every possible thing. We could do the same thing. We could write our entire app in this app component. But what we're actually going to want to do is break things up into components. So what I want to do is write, I want to write an app where I'm going to click on different buttons and change the background color based on which button I click. So I could just, have a bunch of buttons here. I could potentially do all of that stuff here, but I'm first off going to break this up into additional components. So I have my source file, which is where I'm writing all of my code, and I can create subfolders in here to keep things organized. You can kind of do whatever you want. Unlike Django, there really aren't any specific or any default requirements here. But the common thing to do is create a components folder. And then let's write, I'm going to call this a color changer. So I have a color changer app. So I'm going to have to write this. I'm going to use class-based components, and class-based components all inherit from React's component. So I'm going to have to import that. So import. So we saw app did the same thing. I'm going to do a slightly different import statement, which will do the same thing. So import React. We'll do this. I'm going to import React. And then I can create my class. So class color changer extends React dot. So it extends React dot component. So not just component, I directly imported component here. Here I imported React and then React dot component. So, you know, same difference, but you'll see both. So I have my class. The one necessary method I have to have is render. So render, and then I'm going to return something. And what I'm going to return is JSX. I'm just going to leave that there for now. So this is kind of, you know, stubbed out. You'll have to do something like this. There are also extensions in VS Code for taking care of exactly this kind of boilerplate, because you'll have to basically do this at minimum for every component. And then once you have the component, you're gonna have to export it so that you can import it elsewhere. So export default color changer. And typically we're just gonna have one class per file here. So we can use the default export. And then in app, I'm gonna have to import the color changer component. So I'm gonna do import color changer because it's the default export. I don't have to put it in curly brackets. And VS Code auto completed this for me, but from and then the path, the relative path. So from color changer, I'm in app. So I'm going to go into the components folder and then color changer. And you don't need the file extension. So now I have access to this color changer. So I can go ahead and stick this in here. And I will use it'll be a JSX component, so it will look like HTML, but actually be JavaScript. So color changer, close that. And now this is basically like creating an instance of the color changer class in this app component. So here I'm going to return, I'm getting an error. So I'm getting a syntax error. I'm not returning anything. So I'm just going to do like a dummy thing. Okay, I'm going to refresh that. Let me try. This should be the default export. Yeah, sorry about that. So here, if we look at the app, so we can trace it. This is, you know, once you actually start writing, this will be like your effective entry point, but the actual entry point is here. So we have, and if you start messing around with like things like Redux or the context API, you might end up coming in here. But so we have the app. So React DOM.render is rendering our app and sticking it in the root. And then our React, which is a component, can in turn have its own components, and those components can have their own components, and so on. So app returns this JSX, these two elements, in addition to this this other element, which is a component that we've written. And we can see that it's returning all three of those things. And color changer is our own component, which is returning this JSX element, which looks like a paragraph tag. And that's showing up right here. Okay, so what I'm going to do here now, because this is not really doing anything, is I'm gonna add a button. Okay, so I'm getting a bunch of red squiggly lines here. So I'm going to try to save this and run it. And what's my problem?
You gotta wrap it in a
Yeah,
div.
yeah. Or just anything but div would be-
Anything.
Yeah, yeah. There's also, as I mentioned, there's a React Fragment component built for this purpose, but div is a good choice. So div, we're wrapping this now. So now we have this button. The button doesn't do anything. So I'm going to add something else here. So I'm going to add an object. So I'm going to do some inline styling here. So and I'm going to use camel case, background color. And let's add that here. So this might look a little weird, but should also look a little familiar. So I've created separate objects. This is kind of how you handle inline styles in React. Created this object, which can have as many things as you like. And then inside this JSX elements, which looks like a p tag, I have a style attribute. And then I pass in the value here. So if this were Django, we would use 2 curly brackets. React saves you a little bit of typing, and there's only one. So we're passing in this styles object. So that's how you pass in information directly. Use these brackets. Okay. So now this works. So I have a button, but it doesn't do anything. So I'm going to add an on click. So notice that the naming convention here is a little bit different, and I'm going to tell it what function or what method to run. I'm going to put that inside of curly braces because it will be JavaScript. And I'm going to do this dot handle click. So I haven't written this function yet. So what is this?
Referring to the instance of the class.
Yeah. Okay. So this is all happening in the render method. So I'm going to have another method called handle click. Handle click. And anytime you're using like event handlers, you'll want to use the arrow syntax. So when something clicks, I want to change something, presumably. So I have this component here. The background color is red. Let's say I want to change the background color to green when I click. So I have a component. If we think about what, I have component, and then React also has props and state. So this is where state comes in, because I have information within a component that I want to be changeable depending on what a user is doing. So I'm going to write a handle click. For now, I'm just going to do so let's see if this works. I'm going to open up the dev tools in the console. I can see that when I click, this is changing. So that is working. And if I look at the React dev tools, I can see that my hierarchy is, so it's not just app, it's app, and then color changer is within app. Let me expand this. So my app, if I look at color changer, there we go. So we have props and no state. So we have this click handler, but really nothing is going to change. If we want stuff to change, we're going to have something called state. So this is a keyword. We have this thing called state, and I'm going to say, I'm going to call this current background color, and I want that to be red. Okay, so I have state, and instead of hard coding this here, I'm going to make this dynamic, and I'm going to say it's going to be the state's background color. So this dot state dot current background color. And I'm going to refresh this. It should look exactly the same. Still nothing will happen when I click except for the console log. But when I look at components, I should see that I now have this entry for state. And state tells me that I have, within state, I have a value called current background color, and that is red. So how do I, okay, so I have this component, and now I have this thing which is going to be changeable, namely the background color. And because it's changeable, I need to use state. So I put it in state, and then I refer to that wherever it needs to be, in this case, in this styles object. And I have a handle click, which is the event, that I'm dependent on for this event to occur, this change event to occur. And I have a handle click function written. So now I somehow need to change the state. So let's say I just wanted to change it to green whenever someone clicks on it. So how might I go about doing that? Based on what you know from, JavaScript and classes and everything.
This dot state dot current background color equals green.
Okay, so this dot state dot current background color equals. Now this very intuitive this very intuitive thing is wrong in JavaScript. So this is the sensible thing that you would want to do, but that's not how React does it. So I even get a very nice warning here. It says, do not mutate state directly. So do not mutate state directly means don't do this. If you want to change state, you're going to have to use a special method called set state. So it says use set state. So we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is this dot set state. And set state can, it can take a callback, but right now we're just gonna, the simplest case is that it just takes an object, and this will basically do a shallow comparison. So if we have 10 other things in the state and we just want to change one thing here, we can just specify that one thing. So in this case, I want current background color to be green. So set state will take an object. You can also use callback function, but that's something we can talk about later. So it will take an object, and then we just, this is the thing we want. We could also have other things in state. So this will still work. We don't have to recreate the entire. We don't have to recreate the entire object. We can just specify what we want to change here. All right, so I'm going to look at my DevTools again, and I can see that color changer now has two things in state. It has the current background color, which is red, and something else, which is true. And now what happens when I change the color? So I click, change the color. My state has changed from red to green. Something else hasn't changed because we didn't change it. And whenever state changes, React does its magic React stuff, and it will re-render the DOM. So what React does is it has its own internal model of the DOM, which is in memory, so it's very fast. Changing the DOM is kind of an expensive and time-consuming operation. So React keeps an internal representation of the DOM, and whenever anything changes on it, it will basically do a comparison with the actual DOM. It updates the virtual DOM. It does a comparison with the actual DOM, and then will, as efficiently as possible, update the actual DOM to reflect what has just changed in the virtual DOM. So the point of all that, or what actually happens, is that if you change state, then the component will update, basically. So if you change state, the component updates, and then the most recent value is reflected there. So that's the base. I'm going to also show you props. So we have this color changer, and let's say, yeah, I mean, this will be a little forced, but let's say we have the title. So here, again, this looks like HTML, but we should really think of this as creating an instance of a class. And we're passing in a keyword argument. When we pass in a keyword argument, we can access it inside the component. It's like creating an instance of color changer with, like title in the init or something like that. but we can't access it directly. We have to go through props. So there's a props object that comes for free, just like state. So we get this props object. So if I want here in this p tag, I want to use that value that I'm getting from the parent component from app.js, which is called title. I just do this dot props dot title. If I save that, I see that I have the updated the updated title that I'm getting. And if I look at my dev tools, React dev tools, I can see that props now has an entry. So my color changer component has a props and the value of title, tells me what it is, and it also has state. So props is information that's coming from outside, namely from a parent component, and state is internal to color changer. So that's kind of the basic overview, and we'll go through lots of examples, and we'll see how we can kind of get around some of these restrictions, this one-way information transfer. But are there any questions for now? Okay.